Welcome to the Media Navigators podcast, brought to you by the World Media Group. My name is Belinda Barker and I'm the Chief Executive. This is going to be a slightly different type of podcast from normal. So the World Media Group exists to promote the values of journalism to the advertising and marketing industries. But in recent podcasts, we've really been focusing on talking to industry luminaries about kind of thought leadership practices within the industry. But today, we're really going to go back to our roots. We're going to be looking at the changing role of journalism. I'm really lucky today to be joined by one of the industry's great editors, Dan Stewart, who's the international editor for Time magazine. Good morning to you, Dan.
Hi, Belinda. That's very kind of you.
Are you well?
I'm well, thank you, yes.
Good. And we're also going to be joined by Rebecca Vincent, who's Director of International Campaigns with Reporters Without Borders. Now, whilst the World Media Group focuses on commercially trying to support trusted journalism, Reporters Without Borders has a much more hands-on approach, let's put it that way, in terms of lobbying governments, but also supporting journalists out in the field. So I'm really delighted to be talking to Rebecca, who will share more information about this. Good morning to you, Rebecca.
Good morning, Belinda. Thanks very much for having me.
So we're talking about kind of the role of press having changed significantly over the last few years. There's been a lot of talk around fake news, and particularly through Trump. But to some extent, these criticisms have been around since the beginning of, since the very first newspaper was ever printed. And we, particularly in the UK, but in the West, now take journalism for granted. It's just here. And we expect it to be free. But political restrictions have changed that around the world, and actually, surprisingly, locally as well, which I think Rebecca's going to get more into that later on. But before we get into that, I really wanted to kind of start out quite conceptually and consider kind of what our world would be like today if we didn't have a trusted journalistic press. You know, what would have happened in the US elections if they weren't called to account by titles like Time, New York Times, and the other members of the World Media Group? The pandemic, how would we have dealt with the pandemic if we were living purely off social media? So I'd really like to put that to Dan initially. You know, what is your thoughts? Could you try and paint a picture for us, about how you think journalism adds and has changed the way we see things today?
Well, thanks, Belinda. I mean, to answer the question of what the world would look like without a free press, I think, sadly, there are spaces in the world where you can go to get an idea of that. I mean, you know, you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, which is a completely closed information system, doesn't have an independent media. Anyone who dissents against the line of the government or the royal family tends to end up in jail or lose their job. China is another very obvious example. I mean, for all that we have reporting on what is going on in China, it's usually published by Western media, often with the help of Chinese journalists, I should say, or by Chinese journalists. But it's often by Western media that is investigating China. I think within China, if you don't speak English and you don't have access to the internet outside of the Great Chinese Firewall, the vast majority of Chinese people would probably have no idea of what was happening, the abuses that were happening in Xinjiang province, for example, where Uyghur Muslims have been oppressed, or perhaps even in Hong Kong, where we've also seen oppression. So I think there are spaces around the world that don't have a free press. I think to your question of the media's role in keeping the administration and the government in the UK to account, I think it's been a really trying year for journalists, especially with the restrictions that are on us in terms of freedom of movement and so on. I think the fact that the election was not stolen, if you like. I think it was helped by the media, but also it was actually the institutions in the US that proved durable enough not to be stolen. I think if you look at other countries around the world, I mean, Myanmar is a great current example, had their election 2 days after the US election, and the military officials there who were, already held a large part of government decided that, yes, that was a little bit too much democracy, and staged a successful coup in a place where the freedom to report is much, much more restricted than they have in the US.
Do you have the rise in social media and the amount of people who are getting really warped information via social media? Is that a growing concern for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge concern. It's been a concern for years. I mean, I think Time ran a cover in 2017 asking whether truth is dead. We saw this over the course of the Trump administration, especially this sort of diffusion of information and echo chambers that were reflecting their own realities and it seemed to have broken off completely. But again, this is a problem that we've been seeing around the world for a lot longer than that. In the Philippines, for example, where the role of Facebook in spreading fake news, and also in providing these spaces where people don't hear alternate voices and that are able to be controlled, I suppose, by authoritarian governments. It's incredibly hard to counter that. I mean, something that we at Time pride ourselves on a little bit is of having trust, but that trust only goes so far. Interrogating some of the, I suppose, crazier ideas out there. This idea that Democrats are running a paedophile ring out of pizza restaurants, or that Trump is a chosen individual to combat satanic practices, I think is the QAnon theory. Countering those takes a sort of, I think it's a sort of generational task and not something that we can quickly do. It requires educating people on media literacy. And I don't know, Rebecca, if this is something that RSF has looked into, this idea about actually having people engage with journalism in a slightly different way, or sort of relearning how journalism works and understanding a little bit more about the importance of objective facts, if you like.
Yes, the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation has brought with it new challenges to press freedom. But at the same time, I also don't think it's all negative, because the advent of social media has also opened up new space for new types of journalism. So at Reporters Without Borders, we work not only to defend professional journalists, but also citizen journalists around the world. And in some countries that are particularly closed, citizen journalists are doing incredible work trying to get out the truth about even local issues like corruption, for example, of local government. I'm thinking of some courageous citizen journalists in places like Mexico. And some of the spaces that you mentioned, Dan, which are indeed among the most closed spaces in the world, like China, citizen journalists have played an incredible role. And in fact, as a result now, that creates another sort of challenge for press freedom too, because China has at least 117 journalists in jail currently. And we're looking at a global situation, usually of nearly 400 journalists in jail around the world. So a huge percentage of that in China. Many of those are citizen journalists. So regimes are cracking down too. And I think in addition to just focusing on the threats to information and making sure that we're able to promote and defend quality, reliable reporting, that we're also looking at, the new types of journalists who are also being targeted as the result of speaking out or using these platforms.
I thought that was an interesting point, Dan, you made about the education. I'm thinking, in a personal viewpoint, having got two teenagers, how they're educated to understand what is good journalism. Their go-to is obviously social media. Is there a role that we should be playing in terms of educating this new generation coming up to understand what it means?
Yeah, I think some governments, I'd need to do a little bit more research on this, having brought it up, but I think some governments in Scandinavia are beginning to look into government-funded media literacy programs. I think that's probably more suitable for countries that do have a very active government. I think if the US government started introducing that, there would be some very dramatic pushback. But I think that the private sector can be doing that as well. Time has a platform for children, Time for Kids, a publication that a lot of this is introducing them to journalism for the first time from a very young age. We have kid reporters who report on issues that children are interested in, but also introducing them to major news stories and figuring out how to explain the Capitol riots to them in a way that's sort of objective. And I guess trying to engage kids at a young age in what the benefits of discovering more about the world. I think it's a hard thing to introduce it at a formal level, but I think we can all be investing more in these kinds of programs.
Okay, sorry, I feel like we've slightly gone off track here, but we'll get back to the meat of things. And I really wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about where freedom of press is actually declining at the moment. There are some good stories, and we will kind of come real back to that at the moment. But when we were chatting earlier, Rebecca in particular was citing some examples where freedom of the press is significantly declining. And also some slightly worrying issues closer to home. I know the examples I think we were talking about were India and Poland and Belarus, but I think there were others. Where are the biggest concerns for you? Where are you having to work hardest at the moment at Reporters Without Borders?
Well, the alarming truth is that actually press freedom is declining everywhere. And so when you look at a measurement such as our World Press Freedom Index, that's not something that's immediately obvious when you glance and you can see where countries move each year. But what it doesn't show is actually the whole world is getting worse year by year. So we can't become complacent anywhere. But we do see regional indicators. The Middle East has long been the region where press freedom is under greatest attack. Europe has long been the region that has the strongest protections for press freedom. But of course, we're seeing a shifting nature of threats. And that means that we can't consider that journalists are fully safe anywhere. So last year, we saw a situation, even despite the pandemic, despite the fact that fewer journalists were out in the field doing their jobs because much of the world was locked down for a good part of the year, we still saw a situation of 50 journalists killed around the world in connection with their work. But an alarming statistic within that is that every year this has steadily increased, and it increased even more sharply last year. Fewer journalists are being killed in countries that we think of as being at war, countries that are in open conflict, and a greater number of journalists are being killed in countries that are meant to be at peace. So last year, 68% of journalists who were killed were in countries that weren't at war, countries at peace. And of all of the journalists killed last year as well, 84% were deliberately targeted. These are very often investigative journalists that are, working on risky topics such as corruption, organized crime, exposing things that powerful interests want to keep hidden. And so when individuals are at risk in that way, these crimes against journalists don't know boundaries in that regard. And so all of our governments, even our most established democracies, have to be very aware of these threats and proactively act to protect press freedom.
And I think we have to be really careful about what's happened over this past year. You know, while governments around the world have been in crisis, the more authoritarian leaning governments or the outright authoritarian governments have been putting in new limitations on press freedom, out of public safety often, or supposedly, or to sort of protect public order. And I think, there is a great risk that some of those changes will just be be made permanent afterwards. I mean, you spoke about India, for example, which is a great concern of ours at time. The world's biggest democracy, as it likes to style itself, but has been declining press freedoms there for quite a long time. And I think, especially during this lockdown, the Hindu nationalist government led by Narendra Modi has been, holding journalists to check for doing the work of holding the government to account, detaining them, often pursuing them through the courts as well. And charging them with spreading discord. And so the way in which the court system is being used to silence reporting, I think is a great concern of ours there.
Absolutely. And something that we saw, so during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, especially at the beginning, we saw two trends really, which is one, there was a wave of new sorts of violations of press freedom directly connected to the pandemic. So a targeting by governments of journalists who were trying to get out the truth about what they were seeing in their countries. This was perhaps most noticeable in China. And at Reporters Without Borders, we rang alarm bells. We have stated that had free and independent reporting been allowed on the very early phases of the pandemic, possibly this could have been prevented from escalating into a global crisis. We won't ever know. We've just passed the 1-year anniversary where 7 courageous journalists who were detained in China for reporting on the pandemic are still in jail. They've been in jail for a full year. China's not the only country. We saw measures by others that wanted to suppress accurate reporting. I'm thinking of Iran, where the COVID numbers were very high in the early days, and there was a very clear backlash against journalists who were reporting on that. And we saw it in less extreme ways in many other countries. But in addition to those specific sort of actions in response to reporting on COVID, we then saw states like India, as you've mentioned, Dan, we saw many others that took advantage of the world's attention being distracted to either implement new crackdowns or carry out ongoing crackdowns on press freedom. And many of our governments took even less notice than they would have otherwise. We often argue that not enough is done on these issues, even in the best of times. But certainly, when every country is dealing with pressing matters of public health, it's even harder to mobilize them into taking action against the worst offenders in the world.
I mean, even as an ignorant bystander, I was aware at the height of the pandemic that I was just simply not paying attention to other, massive issues in the Middle East or even Brexit. It actually kind of slipped off top of mind because it did feel like the pandemic was everything. Rebecca, I wondered if you could share a little bit more information about kind of how you operate, what. I know that you kind of you have your political spheres, but also supporting kind of journalists on the ground. So who you're working with and funding, how you are funded as an organisation.
Sure. So Reporters Without Borders, we're known internationally as Reporters Sans Frontières. So if I say RSF, that's why. We're headquartered in Paris, and we have 13 other country offices, including here in London, where I work. And we have a network of correspondents in more than 130 countries around the world. So they are really our eyes and ears in many places, including some of the most at-risk places. We work in a range of ways. We're a news service. Our researchers are monitoring and putting out alerts on press freedom developments around the world. We engage in direct assistance, even very concrete things like we loan out flak jackets and helmets to journalists going into conflict zones. For example, we provide an insurance scheme for freelancers. We help get journalists out of harm's way, sometimes help support them, legally or with asylum requests and safe places. We engage in advocacy, as you've mentioned, that's, pressuring governments or international institutions to live up to their own word. So it's not just a matter of words, but actions when we see in terms of enforcing our own national laws that protect free expression and ensuring implementation of international mechanisms that are supposed to protect press freedom. And we do mobilization campaigns as well. We really try to engage the public, make sure the public's aware of these things, and spur people into action on some of our cases of concern. And that's primarily my function at RSF. So I work on the campaign side. So what's on my desk is always the hottest sort of top priority global campaigns at the moment. That includes things like trying to help Maria Ressa hold the line in the Philippines, or seeking justice for the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia. Well, actually, the Saudi columnist who was killed in Turkey, or Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed in Malta. We're campaigning to establish a UN special representative on the safety of journalists. We're campaigning for the release of Julian Assange. So many different types of cases kind of fall to our campaigning side. And in terms of funding, we are a nonprofit. So we get funding from a range of sources, sometimes foundations or grants. We are a membership organization internationally as well. So members will make small regular donations that help keep us afloat. We have a beautiful photo book that is put out 3 times a year in France, Photos for Press Freedom. And it's a historical way that the French public support RSF. That actually contributes significantly to our global budget. But we're really grateful for all forms of support. And to that end, we've been proud to be the World Media Group's named charity partner. I think it's been 4 years running now. So we're grateful for the support that you've given us through the awards, and would be very happy to talk to any of your members about possible further collaboration.
Fantastic. Well, I would like to add a little plug to that is that our World Media Awards are open for entry at the moment, and we would encourage anybody who's considering entering. They are free to enter, but we do encourage you to consider giving a donation to Reporters Without Borders. And there's a very easy link, and you just tap on it, and you can make a donation to them through that. Before we just finish off the podcast, I'd kind of like to leave on a vaguely positive note, despite the depressing statistics that we've been hearing about. Dan, we were talking when we were doing the prep call for this. You were talking about the areas of improvement around the world where new media outlets have helped to hold some governments to account. Can you enlighten us a little bit more around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rebecca already alluded to this, but the ways in which the internet has allowed investigative reporting units to find new ways to tell stories, and to also tell stories directly to people who are fed a diet of state media. I think, Russia is a really good example of that. Russia has, over a dozen investigative bodies, the Bell, Bellingcat, iStories, some of those, like Bellingcat is based outside of Russia. I think it's actually run by a British journalist, but in collaboration with Russian journalists quite often. There's also publications like Novaya Gazeta, which carries on reporting from within Russia. But their use of the internet, often their journalism is in the form of YouTube videos. I mean, you see that most obviously with Alexei Navalny's FBK, his anti-corruption foundation. It's more of an activist organization, but what they're doing is journalism. They're doing investigative reports into, this report that just brought tens of thousands of Russians onto the streets to protest the Putin regime. I don't think the Putin regime is going to fold overnight. The the Kremlin has a tight grip on that country, and it's a huge country, so it's hard to sort of to get a kind of unified course of action. But I think that, to me, shows that journalism can make a difference even in the most tightly controlled areas, and I think that's got to be a reason for hope.
But even, Time magazine is, I'm old enough to remember the days when it purely existed as a magazine, and if you didn't have a newsstand near you that happened to sell it, and let's face it, lots of parts of the Eastern Europe it was extremely difficult to get hold of. By that I mean Time is your journalism is now going out through multiple different platforms to presumably quite a different type of audience. How are you adapting the way you operate? We clearly for quite some time have realized that, in today's world, the need for a weekly news magazine where people get their information is not really relevant anymore. So we have to be much more about a sort of 24/7 operation. We increasingly don't see a difference between print and digital. And we do a lot of our franchises that we've introduced, including the Time 100 Talks, for example. Especially over the pandemic, we've been staging events where we actually talk to people face to face. I think engaging with younger audiences, especially that way, who might not consider buying a print magazine. I will say, a large part of what we do and how it's sort of relevant to this conversation is we have probably one of the more trusted and well-known brands out there, and we have an ability to bring people onto our platform, if you like. And I think that's what we're increasingly trying to do, to give prominence to people like, the people that we made Person of the Year in 2018, right? The Maria Ressa, Jamal Khashoggi, the Capital Newsroom, and the 2 Reuters journalists who are imprisoned in Myanmar. I think we recognize that we have an ability to bring people like that to greater prominence, and we're trying to do that as best as we can on all of the platforms that we use.
And when journalists do that, it's hugely important to us. So I have to say, those Time, Person of the Year covers that were all related to journalism really helped us from a campaigning perspective, because it cut through in a mainstream way. And I have to say, it can be very challenging to get journalists to cover stories about journalism. But when they do, it really makes everything that we do far more effective. And so to leave on a more encouraging note, that's what I would say is we're very keen to explore these kinds of collaborations with media organizations. We're very happy to provide information and to help to any extent that we can to get a bit more coverage of these stories, to show the human impact behind them, because this is not just figures. We look at the situation, 400 journalists in jail around the world, but there's so many human stories within them, and anything that the media can do, including your partners, to really shed light on that helps our press freedom work tremendously.
Well, that's amazing. I don't know, and I will convey that after this to the other members of the World Media Group. There is no quick and easy fix to this one, but we will continue to promote wherever we can. So I'd really like to thank you both. Thank you, Dan and Rebecca, for joining us today. And let's carry on this conversation and make it, help to make it a safer place. The World Media Group is an alliance of leading international media organisations that connects brands with highly engaged, influential audiences in the context of trusted and renowned journalism. I'm delighted to have as members The Atlantic, BBC News Global, Bloomberg Media, Business Insider, The Economist, Forbes, Fortune, Financial Times, National Geographic, New York Times, Reuters, Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. It is a great honour to work with all of them. Thank you.